interculturalism and anti-racism have been active both as approaches in the fight for equality and inclusion. In the wake of the events following the death of George Floyd, which had a huge impact on the awareness of racial discrimination across the globe, these questions have become more and more urgent, not only for activists, but also for researchers and for policymakers, for people working in cities. While interculturalists and anti-racists clearly have shared goals, the different strategies they adopt can prevent them from working together in their efforts to affect systemic change. At the theoretical level, it can be argued that the two approaches are complementary. And we hear this often. People will say, well, I don't really see a difference or a conflict between the two. I see them as more complementary. In practice, however, interculturalism and anti-racism can often be in conflict with each other or at odds with each other. On the one hand, anti-racists claim that interculturalists don't address the real issue of systemic discrimination. And on the other hand, interculturalists claim that anti-racism is too confrontational and causes people from the majority group to be in a position of defensiveness. There are people, obviously, who do both and who work with both perspectives, but they generally tend to subordinate one to the other. And they also say it's not always clear when each approach should be used. When is the best time to use an intercultural approach, and when is the best time to use an anti-racist approach? And so professionals working in cities or working for cities, and also policymakers, are often faced with difficult decisions and sometimes almost impossible choices that have to be made. So what are we actually comparing, or what are we talking about? Interculturalism and anti-racism are not only two principles or two ideals, but they're also two traditions of thought, where interculturalism tends to focus more on social cohesion and on positive interactions between communities, and anti-racism tends to focus on the naming the problems that have to do with power relations, social injustice, and reparations. And so it's important to say before we start that it's not very easy to talk about each tradition as something monolithic. In other words, each tradition has a huge amount of diversity within its tradition. So there's not just one way to do interculturalism, and there's not just one way to do anti-racism. But from a systemic point of view, I think it's fair to say that they're both similar and they're both different. In other words, sometimes they have a similar objective and similar way of analyzing the situation, and sometimes they're diametrically opposed. One thing that seems very clear is that the particular way that cities decide to combine these two approaches, or even in situations where cities decide to ignore them completely, the decisions that cities make about these approaches can have an impact on social outcomes and also on political outcomes. So I just wanted to say those few words to give us a general idea about the issues that we're faced with when we talk about interculturalism and anti-racism. Our research team has a small project looking at the kind of bridges and breakdowns between these two approaches, and it's really a great honor for us to be able to work with the Council of Europe, the Intercultural Cities Program, and also a number of different cities who are trying to make sense of how these issues play out on the ground. So I wanted to ask my colleagues, Irena and Lisa, to say a few words about the general frame for the webinar today. Irena is the head of division Inclusion and Anti-Discrimination Programs for the Council of Europe, and Lisa is founder and director of Culture Brokers in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So Irena, would you like to say a few words?
Let Lisa start because she might need to go early.
Good point. Right. Lisa, would you like to say a few words about the general theme and how it plays out in your local context in Minneapolis?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. I always feel so grateful and humbled having the opportunity to interact with you all across the world. So this is the second opportunity for us to talk about this subject, interculturalism and anti-racism. And I think it's maybe the right opportunity for me to share that those two philosophies and those two approaches are integrated in me, right? I feel like I'm the embodiment of those two philosophies and approaches, and that is that I am a biracial person, Black and white in America. So fundamentally, I have to be an intercultural. I do not dislike any part of me. I do not dislike any part of my culture, and I every day navigate all of those different cultural aspects to who I am and my identity. And also I experience racism, right? And I am exposed to racism, and I feel racism in my community and in my colleagues. So I approach this from that perspective of this is all me, right? This is all about who I am and how I behave and how I think, which means that I don't see a duality so much as appropriate times for those approaches or philosophies to take the lead. And so in subordination, I think that is occasionally appropriate for a person or a city that believes in, or any kind of organization that believes in both. There are appropriate times to be talking about and forwarding or furthering power for groups that have never had it and need to have that in order to be successful as other groups thrive. And there's a time to moderate and negotiate among cultural differences. So the other thing that you—
By the way—
Yes. Okay, sorry. So the other thing I think that's important to know is that I have a business background. I come from business and I own a business. So I think that fundamentally means that I am both entrepreneurial. So I love to try things out, and I have a penchant for innovation, right? And I also am terribly practical. I believe in doing things that people will adopt, that people want to be doing, and so I am extremely excited about how the cities up now that we're talking to are making that all happen. I'm all about results, and so what is very practical to get to results in conditions is something that I'm really eager to explore with you all today. Appreciate the time.
That's great. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks for joining us. Irena, would you like to say a few
Yes.
words about the general context?
Yeah, sure. Well, maybe I'll say that. I think that any antagonism between interculturalism and anti-racism I think it's a bit artificial. I also think it's counterproductive. And here is why. I think there are three key dimensions to inclusion in general. So I tend to talk more about inclusion than integration because it has a much broader meaning for me. And also emotionally somehow intuitively sounds right. So there's first economic inclusion, which means access to education, access to jobs. Social inclusion, access to social networks, to services, to informal relations. And thirdly, and very importantly, symbolic inclusion, which is about not rejecting the other because of fundamental aspects of their being or of their identity, such as skin color, origin, faith, language. Symbolic inclusion is, I think, a really important dimension of inclusion because it explains why migrants and minorities feel rejected, even though their material conditions of life and their formal rights may be equal. And we see this in survey after survey after survey. In fact, we see that in the richest countries in Europe, in any case, there's a higher level of feeling of rejection. So it actually means, of course, it also depends on levels of inequality and many other things. But even if levels of inequality are not that high, there's something else which determines whether you feel symbolically accepted in a community if belong or not. And I call this symbolic inclusion. And I think this notion is really essential to interculturalism. It's unique to its policy paradigm because it's an obstacle to achieving de facto equality of rights. It's an obstacle. If there is no inclusion at a symbolic level, if I'm rejected because of who I am, then there is really no possibility for cohesion or for you feeling a full member of society. So if this is central to interculturalism. But I think that when anti-racists speak about systemic racism, I think they also mean these three levels of inclusion as well, that there is no progress at those three levels of inclusion: economic, social, and symbolic. And I think interculturalists, anti-racists find symbolic inclusion very important. So I think there is quite an alignment there. There is, however, somewhere a difference in the means of action, I would say. Interculturalism is a tool for policy making. That's my view. While anti-racism is a tool for awareness and mobilization. And I think the reason why interculturalism is effective in addressing those three levels of inclusion, especially the symbolic one, is that it's been able to go beyond stating just the need for symbolic inclusion. It actually manages to translate this into policy, and this is very tricky because accepting other people is not something that you can decree by law. How do you make policies that bring people to being accepting of other people's identities and to understanding the plurality of identities and not making those the target of power games? So it takes quite sophisticated and delicately balanced action at many levels and by many actors to achieve that. And interculturalism is really, that's its main goal. Of course, it has a recipe for dealing with it. We'll hear how specific cities are doing it today. To me, putting it in a very simple way, it's interaction. Many of you know that for interculturalist, interaction is the crux. Is the main instrument for achieving inclusion. And that includes things like dialogue, participation, shared spaces, inclusive narratives, power sharing, co-creation, co-decision, intercultural competence, etc., etc. And so these are, I think, are elements that are also important for anti-racism. So, I mean, the more I think about it, the more I think that interculturalism and anti-racism are just probably the same, two sides of the same coin. But let's let our speakers from the cities illustrate this. I hope they will agree with me.
Thanks. Thank you, Irena. It's really interesting to see how these issues play out at different levels, not just in local neighborhoods or boroughs or in cities, but also at the level of policy for large institutions like the Council of Europe. You and I discussed quite a bit about this issue over recent months, and we agreed that after the first webinar, which was more about the theoretical issues and comparing the two approaches, like historically and theoretically, now we're really this time we're more focused on kind of what cities are doing concretely, and how the efforts to pay attention to both intercultural principles and anti-racist principles, how those play out in terms of local policy or programs and what cities see on the ground. So I wanted to introduce very briefly our four panelists. They're coming from places that are very different. Every city is a universe, as I like to say. They're also coming from different time zones, so that's maybe an issue for us today. And we've asked them to consider 4 or 5 questions. We have about 30 or 40 minutes for the discussion, a kind of a roundtable discussion. And the first question that we're going to address is how cities or policymakers attempt to reconcile the work that's being done between the two approaches. So I'm going to introduce just very briefly our 4 panelists, Zara, and we'll go in the same order as I introduce them. Zara Niazi is the program lead for Bradford for Everyone of the Bradford Council in the United Kingdom. Marco Giusta is Deputy Mayor, responsible for a number of important portfolios at the city of Turin in Italy. Teralv Moe, I never remember how to pronounce her name, Teralv, excuse me, is the Senior Policy Advisor and longtime member of ICC at the city of Oslo. And Bushra Manai is the recently nominated Commissioner for the fight against racism and systemic discrimination at the city of Montreal in Canada. So thank you all to each of you and all of you for being with us this morning. I want to start with the first question, and I'm going to ask Zara to kind of start the discussions around this question of how, in your local context, people working in the city attempt to reconcile and the work or encourage joint work between proponents of interculturalism and anti-racism.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm really excited from Bradford to be here. Obviously, it's raining and grey, so I apologise if people can't see me very well. I am just going to give you a little bit of background context to sort of where I am. So I do work for Bradford Council and lead on the Integration Cohesion Programme, which runs under Bradford for Everyone. The programme is one of 5 in England, based in the north, to test and learn from what works and what doesn't in integration cohesion. Now that's quite important because that kind of sets the premise, if you like, of what I'm going to be talking about. So I would say I'm neither an anti-racist or intercultural expert. I don't have an academic background in either of these approaches. What I would say is my own background is very much entrenched in community, innovation and design and entrepreneurship. And actually to a very large extent, that's really influenced about how we've shaped the programme and what we've done in Bradford City, and kept at the forefront what we know and understand about communities and how organisation, systems and structures really aid or hinder equality and inclusion. And I think we've been in a very privileged place because the test and learn element has really given us a gift, and that gift is that we've been able to take risks, which is unusual for a local authority. So despite being a very political organisation, we've challenged power structures, we've been rebalancing who makes the decisions, building social capital in communities to shift that conversation, as in who sets the agenda, who sets the direction and who's in the room. And we've had our fair share of political pushback on that. And also as an integration area, that status, I guess, has led us to boldly focus on interventions across our 4 pillars of getting on, getting along, getting involved and feeling safe, and they're quite self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go into detail what the pillars are around, but we've just really wanted to focus on all communities and areas across our district by now delivering over 70 different types of projects and interventions which are being co-created with partners we work with, but also residents, focusing on elements of social equality, social inclusion, social capital, social diversity, social development, really, I think, driven by this kind of simple approach that by enabling people to engage in all aspects of public, social, economic life, we could really enhance their well-being through an increased sense of belonging and connectedness, pride, emotion and psychological security and safety. And that, for us, really ultimately frames the vision, I guess, within the Stronger Communities Together strategy, which underpins the Bradford for Everyone programme. So I think in terms of our strategy, I would say broadly it's intercultural, although that was completely unintentional and accidental. We've learned so much, to be honest, by being involved with the ICC. But originally when we designed the programme, we wanted to speak to the masses without risking alienation. And actually there's a large ambivalent population that often sit on the fence. And we asked ourselves the fundamental question of, you know, instead of concentrating on either side of the spectrum, which commissioners and programme services tend to do, you know, you either target those people who we don't seem to engage very well versus kind of far right or extremist groups, if you like. How can we mobilise the people in the middle, and how do we get them to advocate and be part of a movement, which would kind of led us to develop some really innovative networks. But we also wanted to be really ambitious, really, as well, to delicately and carefully discuss some of the more difficult and tougher issues on colonisation, Palestine, Black Lives Matters, etc. And we wanted to really reach those voices that usually are overlooked and might take to social media with their concerns, but equally recognise that our engagement methods needed to be far more sophisticated and intelligent. And that is still something that we've been grappling with through the work, through our campaigns. And I guess the other thing that I wanted to say is that we do focus on place quite a lot. I think the approach used depends very much on the assets in that place, but also who makes up that place and where that community is on a readiness scale. So just out of, I suppose, interest is that we've been testing a model that was developed by the Tri-Ethnic Centre for Prevention Research to gauge where our communities were on specific issues. And what we did with that was we tailored those interventions based on the results that we had. And I can expand a little bit more about that when we go into the panel discussions if people are interested. But we also considered the way we use language and the way we communicate holistically about the programme, remaining, I guess, inclusive and welcoming diversity, not just in terms of culture, but also, this is really important, I think, but also diversity of thought and opinion. And then the way we've consciously adapted language deliberately depending on where and who is something we try to balance while being really authentic, I think, and true to who we are and what our ethos is about. And actually, integration and cohesion in Bradford and across England is perhaps, if you looked at it as a spectrum or a scale, it's seen as the lower end of the scale, which plays into a much more wider narrative about being preventative and early intervention approaches, which over a long period of time would reduce incidences of radicalisation, counter-extremism, terrorism. And also, and I think Arena touched on this, is that we found in the development of our programme that poverty was a real divider and was a real source of feelings of unfair distribution of wealth and resources. And actually this continues to widen due to COVID. So while as we recognise race being quite an important factor, and there is space for that, by and large we try and focus on intersectionality, and I think we still try to get that right, not just in terms of delivery, but using, I think, data more powerfully as well to create more in-depth narrative and stories. So in terms of developing our initiatives and interventions, there is a real mix and match of different things actually within when we talk about those 70 projects. They're anything between improving access and provision, coordination, progression in those people who can't speak English language, to those supporting different community with job ready in different ways, and also addressing structural and systemic inequalities through our inclusive employers work, our workforce training, and all of that is being complemented with our campaigns such as our development of our district shared values and our anti-rumor and critical thinking strategy. And then we've also looked to increase the knowledge base and representation of our workforce to be better equipped to respond to the needs of our community, which has been really important actually, to be able to run lots of hyper local activities driven by local people and grassroots organisations, such as those kind of community conversations. And then we've also thought about ways that we can think about access, for example, laptops for refugee and asylum groups, reducing social isolation for our most vulnerable, and tackling community tensions in particular neighbourhoods, especially where there's been high levels of migration and change. And I guess I just wanted to end on a few notes while I come to the end of this. But some of the fundamental principles of how we reconcile, I guess, and balance these two approaches. And I think they really do complement really well. But also in some instances, we would choose one or the other depending on who the community is and where they're at. And what do we actually want to achieve? So what's the ultimate goal? So the four kind of things really, and I've touched on this already, is one is about just recognising intersectionality, because many of our communities and families experience not just one type of inequality. Often these are really compounded and layered. In fact, the true extent of the issues are so well hidden and far more complex than we give really note to. And actually how they play out in people's lives is really, really diverse and different. The second is we do try to work in partnership and in holistic way across services rather than silos. So I think the important thing is that we do try to build on what in terms of our assets there, recognising that what people have got to offer, and I think it's about enabling people to retain their sense of pride and dignity and sense of ownership and responsibility and accountability. So we certainly don't say in this respect that we are the experts and we deliver everything. I think there's a whole lot of listening that happens within Bradford. The third is that we know that not all of our communities start actually in the same place, that they don't have the same experiences, and this can be, of course, a great source of innovation, but also raises very different types of needs and conflict and misunderstanding. So actually, commissioning and working with a range of different partners, we've got around about over 40 different types of providers in our district, and recruiting and working very closely with local people who know their communities well was actually really fundamental in making some of the stuff that we were doing land really well in those areas. And then the fourth thing is we've built, I think, space for people to engage at very different levels from across the programme, from decision making at board level to people supporting their own communities, leading to co-creation where delicacy is needed, and recognition of that complexity, but also dealing with things, I think, with love and care, because people are very passionate about this agenda, and we find that there are quite a lot of motivated people in our district that really want to make a difference and make a change. And actually what they want is an enabler to do that and some support to do that. So we see our role more of a facilitation role in some respects, but also I think the strength of what we do is because of the strong connections and the local community knowledge and good relationships, and actually working with people, not doing to people. So essentially that's kind of where I think what we do in Bradford.
Okay, thank you, Zara. I love this idea of accidental interculturalism. It's new to me, but it seems really like a great description of how things have panned out there. And I think it's interesting the focus on the local aspect, and how in a local setting interactions matter just as much as issues having to do with inequality and social justice. So we have a really good idea of how that plays out locally. I want to give the microphone to our friends in Italy. I think that Marco Giusta is going to begin with a few words, and then his colleague is going to add some elements. So we're still working on the first question. Try to keep our time down to 5 minutes if possible. Marco, are you there? Everything okay?
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. For us, diversity, intercultural, anti-racism, and inclusion are strategic dimension for our city and for our future. But my English is not so good to argue, so let me introduce my staff colleague, Claudio Tocchi. He will speak for the city of Torino.
Okay, thank you, Marco. Your English is great, by the way. So, Claudio, you're going to take it away?
Yes, I will, and thank you, Marco. I hope my English will be good enough for the conversation. Do you hear me from the far distance that I'm talking? Very good. Well, thank you for the invitation and thank you for the opportunity. We've been discussing over the last days and extensively over the last 2 minutes over how we're gonna break the dimensions that we were referring to down and how we're gonna present it. And by the way, I think this way of we also see anti-racism and intercultural action as two sides of the same coin, but the fact that we had to reflect upon it helped us a bit frame our work. So at least from a theoretical point of view, it was interesting to have this discussion and try to frame it this way. We're like right now saying, hey, by the way, that activist that we were considering, yeah, he's more of an activist on anti-racism and would not really care about intercultural. So there are some examples and there are some strategies that were different, and we were not just now framing that this way. But for the most part, we would say the stakeholders and the need holders that we have in the city of Torino were pretty much the same, and the partners that we have in the intercultural policies and in the anti-racist policies were the same, which are basically the communities with a foreign background that are living in our city. Torino is the fourth biggest city in Italy. It's about 800,000 inhabitants, and about 50% of them are foreigners. Plus, you should add all those who acquired Italian citizenship or whose parents are foreigner but are Italian citizens, but nonetheless can be racialized, can be survivors of racist acts, and for sure are bringers of a different culture, a different language, a different religion, So we would more or less consider the persons that have an intercultural background / are racialized in this town at about 20%. How we try to deal with that, and I think we are more or less repeating what was said before. We also think that dealing with seeing our work from the side of intercultural action or on anti-racism depends on the time, on the community, on the district or neighborhood, sometimes on the moment. But really is two ways of improving access to social dimensions, economic dimension, and symbolic dimension, which was really important, especially in intercultural actions and events that we try to bring in the landmark monuments or in the landmark spaces of the town. For example, hosting the celebration for the Romanian the anniversary for the celebration for the anniversary of the Romanian state in the most important monument of the city of Torino was perceived by the community as the achievement of a path of inclusion and integration within the city. The fact to be hosted there led them to see their process of integration as more or less concluded, which was really interesting from our point of view. But the question was how we bring cultural activists and anti-racist activists to dialogue. I think maybe the most relevant policy and instrument that we more recently adopted was to spend 1 year to draft a pact on anti-racism on the urban commons. Urban commons are a particular legal entity which basically puts administration and law and civil society stakeholder on the same level in taking care of a good which is considered common, which means it's something like water or education, or in our case, anti-racism. So over the last 12 months, we engaged with 60 stakeholders and need holders on the territory. Some of them were communities, racialized communities. Some of them were anti-racist activists. Some other trade unions or big networks of NGOs allied. We could consider them. We also tried to bring in an intersectional perspective because we had the LGBT associations and not only them. And together we created a space where not only those associations could, dialogue and argue and discuss, but also had to take decisions because we let the community decide which priorities were to be addressed over the next years and in which order, which of course creates a pattern of action for the city and the institution, but also foresees the agreement on these priorities and on this order. In this way, intercultural action and anti-racism were linked together. And I think, and then I will close and then we can address during the next session more questions. I think what we've seen from our experience is that intercultural somehow goes from very often went by starting working with one community, for instance, the Romanians or the Islamic community, helping them organize a big visible event, which was meant to reduce the level of conflict in a particular district or in the city or by the public opinion, and then by helping them framing the event, including other communities or other faiths or other religions. So going from one to many. While working on anti-racism, we always adopted the strategy to involve all the racialized communities from the very beginning all together. And I think a possible explanation of that is that on intercultural actions, the city as an institution is perceived as an ally, as a facilitator, Whereas on anti-racism, the institution can be part of the problem, can be the actor who is acting racism. And in this way, we found it more balanced that the institution in this case is confronted with a larger front of civil society associations or actors, because the one-to-one relationship, the power balance is too much on the side of the institution. So in more confrontational dialogues, we found that it was more inclusive to have a wider space for the civil society and the community to talk with the institution. I think our time is over.
Yeah, thank you.
We gladly give back the word.
Okay, we're gonna come back to the roundtable, and everyone will be able to add some more information about local context. But I'm really interested in this strategy about beginning with one community and then kind of spanning out to make links with the other communities. And what you said at the end is very important too. The perception of the city and the perception of public institutions, it varies from one community and from one individual to another. And sometimes immigrant communities or migrant communities can actually see the city as the source of discrimination or as a systemic racism. So we're going to talk about that in the next steps of the roundtable. I want to ask my colleague Taral to step in and tell us some things about the situation in Oslo.
Sure, you can just show this. Yes, you can go on to the next. Well, anyway, I'm Toralf Moe. I work in City Hall, but for the last half year, since November, I've worked from my apartment. Tomorrow, we expect restaurants and pubs to open. So we look forward to that, because summer is coming. But no cinema, no concerts, no parties since November. To this question, I want to show you, to use my 5 minutes to just show you that these two approaches that Bob speaks about is really mixed in Oslo. And in this first page is our, in some, our policy statement, and it's repeated in lots of strategy documents and steering documents for the city of Oslo. And these values, you could say that appreciation of diversity has something to do with interculturalism and this symbolic inclusions that Irena spoke about. And the next protection against discrimination is about anti-discrimination and anti-racism measures. But we say that that there will be no diversity without justice if you're not allowed to be diverse, if you don't allow to be successful, if you are come from a diverse background. And the same that the principle of justice has no meaning without these freedoms. So you can go on to next. I want to show some practical, because when I first heard about this distinction, I thought it was a bit academic. And my work is in developing policy and making more visions into practical reality. And I always ask, this is a good measure, this is something we should do, but do we have the means, do we have the money, do we have the people to do this? I work now with an action plan against hate speech and hateful attitudes. Expect it will be approved by the city government the next month, so I can translate it and send it to you. But it has 3 strategies, and the first, to prevent and limit the extent of hate speech and hateful attitudes, this strategy will be much about interculturalism again, about learning about differences and expanding knowledge, especially for people working in the city. The next will be about anti-discrimination and to have systems that sanction hate speech, discrimination, and so on. And we want to be confrontational. I last heard now that the vice where I work for want to make this plan public on the 22nd of July. And I don't know if you remember, it's 10 years ago, but then that was the time when the terrorists killed some 70 people in Oslo and blew up the houses of government. So it should be to confront hate speech also. So that is an example that things are mixed. They also this year put up a new municipal advisory board for intercultural minorities. Lots of discussion on this name in Norwegian. And you can see all the things that this board should give advice to the city government on. But the interesting thing is that we had such a board since the 80s, and it was elected by organizations that were based on the origin of migrants. And they were organized on a continental way, the elections to the board and so on. So many people from the Middle East, so many people with connections with Southeast Asia and so on. And after 20 years of doing that, we thought that this board didn't give any good advice anymore. It was too narrow, and it didn't reflect reality in Oslo, because now people with a minority background, ethnic minority background, they very seldom make organizations based on that. It's just newcomers who do that. So you won't find such organizations among Norwegian Pakistani, for instance. So it's a change. And it's also changed that these people now are much more interested in anti-discrimination than on preserving their cultural heritage in a way. This year we are going to celebrate 50 years of migration to Oslo, and we gave the Pakistani community in Oslo the task to organize such an event and invite all our communities. But there is not really a Norwegian Pakistani community. So we had to ensure that 4 women and 4 men in the committee, and for old people, first generation, for young people, because these people don't have the same agenda. We also are going to next year to have a municipal policy for religion and life stances. Would be interesting, but what I've seen so far is this is much about equality or equal access or recognition. But it's not so much about differences, really. In the constitution or laws in Norway, it's very few groups that are recognized as communities or groups with a special status, and that would be different from Canada, I expect, and also maybe for the United States. The Sami people, or Aboriginal people in northern Norway, many of them live in Oslo, and some groups like the Jews and Romani people have special rights. And that means that the states provide money for cultural heritage and for language training in schools. And we asked these people to join this new intercultural minorities board. And we thought maybe that would be a problem for the Sami because they wanted some bigger recognition, but they didn't. They really didn't. So they thought themselves as a minority in Oslo, but in the same way as Norwegian Somalis and so on. But we have much more strong laws on equality and discrimination. Just take the next. I think I round up. So to sum up, these policies are mixed. There's much more stress now on equality and anti-discrimination, and is driven by minorities themselves. In Norwegian language, these terms are blurred. We use a term called flerkulturell. It can be translated both to multicultural and intercultural. The term likhet can be translated both to equality and egality or sameness. So it's a bit philosophical. You have to be at the university to discuss this, really, and introduce English terms. The backdrop to all this is that equal access to work, education, housing, what's provided in the Norwegian welfare policies, has been beneficial to minorities. So if you look to people born in Norway, it's not big differences in education, employment, housing, ownership, and also in family size and birth rate. And I'm an anthropologist, and the most important cultural differences you can see is between children and adults and men and women, but these differences are not. If you go to a Norwegian Pakistani family, both are born in Norway or mixed marriage, you don't find so much differences in family values here. So adaptation to majority cultural norms are prevalent, and we've also found a research now the last year, 2 years ago, I think, among Norwegian-born Muslim youth. And this is the group that is most concerned about discrimination. So it could be interesting why they choose to be more Muslim, to use that identity mark, and to be more interested in religion. But they also found that thinking about religion is more akin to Protestant Christian thinking. Personal relationship to God, not the 5 pillars of Islam and so on. So that is my comment on this question. It's very seldom. We don't have institutionalized groups or provisions in the city of Oslo anyway that puts the intercultural people and the anti-racist people in different groups or offices or programs. So we don't see this as a conflict very often. So, thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I forget that you're my anthropology brother. Thanks for your presentation.
Can I just ask, you're not seeing the presentation anymore, right?
Yeah, it's unshared.
Okay.
So, Charles, it's funny what you say about these academic debates. I know there's a lot of stereotypes about us academics. It's fascinating how you say that it's not really, these two approaches aren't really in conflict with each other because they're not set up in the organization of the city as different sections. So cities have to struggle with the idea of, well, in terms of which programs or which situations do I apply which principles. So, but I also like what you said at the end, this idea that maybe certain migrant communities are either more affected by discrimination, or certain migrant communities are more concerned with and more mobilized around the issue of systemic discrimination. So I want to bring in Bushra to see if you can give us some ideas about how this is playing out in Montreal, a place where obviously these issues have been important for a long time, and now the city has really taken the lead with regards to, I would say, provincial and federal governments. The city has really taken the lead on the question of racism and systemic discrimination. Can you give us an idea about what it looks like here in Montreal?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Bob. I'm very pleased to be with you this morning. So maybe as an introduction for everyone to have the same idea of what is the position of commissioner and what am I doing in my everyday life. So in Montreal 2 years ago, we had a social and I would say civic mobilization that led the city of Montreal to create the Bureau. The Bureau to fight racism and systemic discriminations with a position of commissioner. And the commissioner have to work with an operational team. So I'm the new commissioner since January. And the work of the commissioner and of the Bureau is to work on the 38 recommendations that like all Montrealers that participated to the consultation, to the civic consultation, wanted as changes in the city and in the metropolis. So the 38 recommendations, were about social housing, but housing, human resources within the city of Montreal, policing and public safety, political recognition of people of diversity or people that can be identified as racialized. So it's a lot of different topics and issues, and the Bureau that has to tackle racism and systemic discrimination is a work that is supposed to metabolize, as I always say, the changes within the institution and within the administrations. And the work is different from my colleagues from the service of diversity and inclusion, because in Montreal we have a service that is dedicated to inclusion and to social inclusion and to diversity, but in interaction within with communities. So my work is dedicated to the changes and to the transformation that need to be done within the municipal administration. And I think it's really important to say it because in my presentation, I will focus on changes and inclusion and diversity and the two perspectives, with issues that has to be done as an institution. So when we recognize racism, discriminations that are that need to be tackled as an institution, how do we work it? But maybe as an introduction, I would say that we live in a province where interculturalism is really embedded to a lot of political discourses or political programs or propositions. So in a way, it is sometimes hard, but honestly, the dialogue is here. But sometimes it's interesting to see how metropolis and how the cities are trying to change with the paradigm of anti-racism, where the state or the provincial state in Quebec is more it's easier to use interculturalism or racism than systemic racism. So we have this discussion in Quebec, and I think it's really important for all the people present here to understand it. As a commissioner, and I know I'm kind of the anti-racist perspective sometimes in events, but I always plead for the cohabitation of the two approaches within institutions and administrations. And as I said, my talk and the examples I will give about public safety, so the work of police, or within the human resources issues that need to be tackled within the administration, I will have the focus of the administration and the institution. I've been working since 4 months now, and I always use this so the two perspective first, but I also use another triptych, and I always talk about racism and about systemic discrimination and on how we can work on it with these three categories. So are we trying to promote diversity and inclusion? Are we trying to prevent some problems to come, or are we fighting, or are we already combating? So with the 38 recommendation, I tried to categorize what people need, and what we can what I say every day to the people I work with is that if you don't want to put the energy on fighting racism, you have to put the energy on preventing. So, and it's the same thing for public safety. It's the same thing for human resources. So you have to be in the promotion or recognition and preventing scale in order not to have to deal with scandals. And I will go with some detail, because in Montreal in the last week we had a very intense and high scandal in one of the boroughs because of a racist climate within workers of the city, and it's always the continuum, as I would say, is to focus on promoting and preventing in order not to work and to put the energies on fighting. Of course, I'm here to fight and to combat racism, so I try to help my colleagues to understand in which and I would also say, and I think the first speaker talked about it, as a geographer, I have to also plead that either we're using the intercultural or the anti-racist perspective. We also have to deal with the realities of the spaces and the territories where people that experience exclusion or marginalization, where they are. So I think when I say we have to see the two perspectives and to make them cohabitate, because you don't use the perspective, like the intercultural perspective, same time, I would say, and in the same spaces. So place, as my colleague said, is really important. And maybe just to finish, I would say that both intercultural and anti-racist perspective allows us to change two things. So we have the cultural the culture organisationnelle, so the organizational culture. So I would say you have culture and you have policies. And for me, the two perspectives allow us to change culture, but also policies. And my colleague said intercultural perspective is probably better to promote policies. And I would say that probably in Montreal, the political leadership wanted the anti-racist perspective to also change policies and to change the charter of values, charter of values of Montreal. And a few weeks ago, we changed we introduced the systemic perspective in the charter of value of Montreal. So it's la charte montréalaise. And I think it's really important because it's a way also to tackle discriminations that are experienced by a lot of different people, not only racialized people, but also to tackle capacity and a lot of different discriminations. And maybe to finish, I just wanted to highlight an ambivalence that my colleagues from Italy also pointed out, is that how you metabolize and mainstream anti-racism in the institutions that sometimes people think that are part of the problem. And I think it's the ambivalence I work with every day. But I try in my work to use both anti-racist when it's needed and intercultural when it's needed, because for me the idea of both perspective is to tackle exclusion, and if we use anti-racist or intercultural perspective is to promote something, and it's to promote inclusion. So I would stop here and I would give more examples.
That's great. It's funny. It seems like people who work with an anti-discrimination perspective often use the word exclusion, and people who work with an intercultural perspective often use the word inclusion. And so one little trick we've been playing with in our team is how to go from exclusion to inclusion, because you need both. You have to talk about both, but they're not necessarily the same strategies. And so, Bosha, you said that it's really interesting. You try to kind of keep both kind of suspended in the air, and you decide, depending on which situation, which approach is going to be the best to use. And that's really interesting. It makes me think of this example that comes up a lot in the city of Montreal with all of these programs with the community policing, and I know that's something that's been really active in the States, and also it's starting much more in European cities. But if we look at the example of the very concrete example of racial profiling, you kind of need both approaches, but not at the same time and not from the same people. So you need initially to have the anti-racist activists say, we have a problem, film this, we name this problem, it's urgent, we have to do something. And then you have the interculturalists who kind of work behind the scenes, and they do like the community liaison officers, and they establish trust and confidence. And so, it's a really good example of how the two types of programs can work together. If you only do one, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work. And so they don't really, as we talked about in the first webinar, the two approaches don't really work with the same strategy. They don't have the same rhetoric, and they also don't have the same time frame, right? Anti-racism has a much more urgent sense of acting now. We have to act now in the present. And interculturalism kind of looks a little bit more long-term and thinks about organizational change and kind of developing competencies and things like that. I know that's something you've done a lot of work with in Montreal, so thanks for your presentation. What I wanted to do now is, we won't have time to ask all the questions that we planned on, but I wanted to focus on maybe two of the questions that we identified when we set up the webinar. And the first of those questions is maybe a little bit hard to answer, but I wanted to ask our four panelists to say something about what they see as challenges. Like, what kind of obstacles have they faced, or challenges in terms of making sure that these two very important principles are kind of, put into practice or operationalized. And you can go in the order that you want. Zara, Teralv, Claudio.
Well, as I said, it's not very often that we, from the cities, programs or interventions make this either or. So when we see or look at our own services, for instance, it's very much about learning about courses for employees. And we also say that we must have an understanding of a diversity to deliver quality services. If you don't build trust, if you don't ensure that the services are beneficial for all, if you don't make everybody feel welcome when they try to access the services in themselves are not really very good. It's low quality. So, and in this message, we mix his message, and of course, to discriminate is not just unjust, but it's also to deliver very low quality services. And you can look at the police in so many American cities; they don't fight crime anymore if they can't build trust.
You see trust as a major obstacle.
If
or challenge.
People don't feel welcome, if they feel that the services are not for them, or they get less quality, the aim of the service is not fulfilled. And Norway and also the city of Oslo is very much a welfare state where most of the services are built to include people and to lift people up. It was that from the start, from 150, 200 years ago. And it has also lifted up minorities of all kinds. But if you don't include all in this, the services, you don't fulfill the aim of the service or the aim of your job. And in this message, can do lots about creating that understanding and to prevent discrimination. And a very huge portion of this message could be said to be about interculturalism. But also we have to sanction those who just stay on doing the wrong things and have a system, because if people adapt to discrimination, and that is the worst consequence of discrimination, is that people adjust to it in many ways. That is the worst, but fundamentally they get a lesser chance to fulfill their ambitions or their qualities in life. And that is the worst consequence of discrimination.
Yeah, that's interesting to see that part of the political vision of the city is to see its role as making it possible for people to lift up or to help people lift up. I think that's an interesting image, right? And also, I think you're right that people don't. That when people get used to discrimination, that's really dangerous. And how do we avoid that kind of prevention that Bosha was talking about? Bosha, do you want to jump in and talk about
just to say that this necessity to act now, to say that this is wrong, that is maybe one of the things that make people not adapt to discrimination. So that is why it's important.
Bosha, do you want to?
Yes, I think what is being said is really important. Since 4 months, I have to admit that cities are dealing with issues that the state is not dealing with anymore, or like it is dealing with very differently from what we. When we believe in democracy, we believe in inclusion within institutions. So one of the biggest challenge in my work, as I see it, is that cities have to have strategies to tackle the issues that the state don't want to deal with anymore. And I just give one example. The work of police officers in Montreal, in their everyday life, is a high proportion of the work they have to do is to deal with mental health issues, and mental health issues shouldn't be in that very high proportion a work that is like given to police officers. So it's just a very small example, but I think it's the challenges are also like to have the leadership as cities to name the problems that need to be like given to the state back. Like I think we have to tackle problems. Like I mean, in Montreal we have issues. The public administration is not representative. It's not diverse enough, and I'm working on it. But sometimes in my everyday work, I'm like, I think it's the state issue to deal with this, not mine. But I would give maybe one example that for me is really important. I didn't like before the position of commissioner. I used to be also a researcher, and I have a background in geography and urban studies. So for me, the idea of equity, of diversity, and working EDI within the administration is a way to think and to make strategies to make the city livable for everyone. So that's my idea of anti-racism. So that's my idea of why we need inclusion within the municipal administration. And I had examples like on how the bureau is working on it. So a colleague of mine, Nathalie Carenard, is working on EDI issues, and Alain Babineau is working on public safety, and to make public safety, of course, something that we need, but without discrimination. So it's a way to work on an institution that needs to change itself to make an inner transformation in order to promote, to prevent, and to tackle inequities in its services, in its programs, in how you finance groups. So for me, how do you say guérisseur?
A healer, a therapist.
Yeah. So sometimes I feel I'm like a healer within the city of Montreal, and honestly, it's really interesting because when you allow the civil servants to make mistakes, to talk about either anti-racist or anti-cultural issues, about intercultural or anti-racist situations, you make them you make the conversation possible. And for me, it's all about how you make the conversation. So I think one of the not the challenges, but one of the necessities is that you have to have someone open to the both perspective to tackle the problems and to deal with the situation. Sometimes it's too late. You have to have action plan that are anti-racist. But sometimes you also have to work on I don't know how you develop, you allow your civil servants to develop their with trainings, but intercultural training. So race is not the problem all the time, but if you don't deal with it, it could be a problem.
Yeah.
So that's.
Bosha, thank you. There's a link between what you said and what Taral was saying. Is that I think what you're referring to is it's a planet-wide problem. Cities are not representative in general. Are not representative of the local population. So it's the majority group that is more in playing the role of civil servants. I think it may be in some Anglo-Saxon contexts, like I think Toronto does a better job of diversity representation in the city than Montreal does if we compare the two cities. But Toronto has a multicultural approach, and the multicultural approach, even though it talks about discrimination, it's kind of more focused on recognizing specific communities. And Taral was saying this isn't necessarily the approach that people want. What they want is they want to feel like they're a part of the city. And so the link between what you're saying is people don't feel like they're a part of the city if they don't see people of diverse backgrounds who work for the city. So that's a major challenge. I really agree with your answer to that question. Zara or Marco or Claudio, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, so in terms of Bradford, I guess that everything that's been said so far completely echo that and agree. And I guess we've not had much conflict between the two approaches, really, or challenges, really, in the sense, because I think the program really harnesses those quite well and utilizes both approaches just quite well without any real conflict. But of course, we are operating in the kind of real world scenario and the context, so we have to really consider really carefully all the time about the tone and language we use, who we're using it for, where, and who for. But I think the thing probably to note is I think we often seek absolutely the same goals, but the relationship sometimes with anti-racists from a local authority perspective anyway can be seen quite hostile and at times feels really threatening to people and judgmental. So without really consciously considering ourselves to be just intercultural, when it comes to a policy from a local authority perspective, or even within the government, we tend to take sort of an intercultural approach, which is really about bringing people together to have that kind of shared understanding of each other and looking at our commonalities. Of course, in Bradford, we've done a lot of that, probably the best part of 20 years, more or less since the Bradford riots in 2001. And policies, do need to tackle racism, but they need to work in tandem with approaches to reduce inequality in general. And I think period of austerity that hit for us in the UK and across England really reduced a lot of that resourcing and support to the most disadvantaged people. So those people that were mainly marginalised and discriminated against. But we're all trying to get to the same place in the end. So obviously there needs to be some kind of a moral approach, I think, to tackle racism and effectively punish racism, if I may say. But the only way I think to eradicate racism altogether is really to ensure that people are able to understand each other better and share their issues together to be able to come up with collective responses and solutions. So indeed, some of our projects like the Linking Network, it does, just in one project, will harness two of these approaches in tandem, depending on the audience. And of course, in some ways, we'll name the problem very openly and we'll openly discuss those. But in other respects, we'll use very subtle metaphors, for instance, as a way to address it. So I think it's just about consciously using this and understanding what would work for the audience at the time. And of course, this is for me, about incremental growth. We're taking people on a journey, and that's what we're going to realise, that if you understand where people are at, you can then meet them at that point and then use the approach that is needed. So I certainly think that in terms of the challenges, I think we have still got a lot to learn, and I think as politicians and the local authority, I think there is a bit of confidence that needs to be had that some of these approaches can be used. So I think that because we are in a very unique position as a programme, that level of risk taking for us is a lot more higher, just because we have a multi-agency approach. We are accountable to a separate partnership board, but certainly I think for civil servants, particularly in the local authority and the government, will probably be less risk averse because of the politicians play a much more stronger role in how we might address some of these issues.
That's interesting. I like what you said about taking a kind of taking a moral stance and seeing this as a moral issue. I think both interculturalists and anti-racists are comfortable with that moral stance. I'm going to ask Irena a question about that in just a minute. But I mean, these are moral questions. They're not just pragmatic or, kind of economic issues. They're moral questions. And cities are more and more find themselves in the role of having to take a position on these issues. Also, you said that might be another interesting difference between the two approaches, is that with regards to racism or discrimination, the anti-racist approach calls out and talks about punishing and having consequences, and then the intercultural approach is maybe more incremental and says, we need to kind of accompany people. We don't want them to get too defensive. So it's interesting when people can do either of those things or both. I mean, it's not really. I think another thing that where they meet each other is they both agree that it's important to name certain issues, but they maybe don't name them in the same way. So before I go to Irena, I wanted to see if Marco and Claudio have any comments about the challenges and
Well, we actually do, and well, thank you for giving us the word. What we were discussing right now was, and we really like what Busha was saying about the state not taking responsibility and cities jumping in, and also what you, Bob, were saying. And we were wondering whether we can talk about cities in general or rather big cities. And I also, I mean, I look at this panel and I think of panels I've been attending to over the past 5 years of our mandate, and most of the time international panels on these topics mainly included big or mid-big size cities. When I can talk about Italy, I don't know that much about other countries, but like over 50% of the foreigners in Italy live in cities that have less than 50,000 inhabitants, which means more than half of the foreign population live in small cities / towns / villages. And I wonder whether these administrations do have the personnel to establish an intercultural office and anti-racist office, whether they do have the competences, whether they do have the language competences to attend or to participate at European grant circles, and whether they can exchange practices, whether they have the chance to really invest in this kind of issues. And Torino is not representative in the sense that most of cities in Italy do not look like Torino in terms of size, in terms of public officers, numbers, and office. And I wonder whether we're, well, I don't even know the question, which one would it be, but the state is not taking a lead on these kind of issues, at least not the Italian state. Italy is one of the few European Union countries that does not have a national anti-racist plan. Torino does, and we recently established a new project to exchange practices with other smaller cities to see whether an anti-racist plan fits those kind of realities, whether it makes sense. But it's like the very first step towards this achievement, and it's limited to a few realities. So I would like to know whether this kind of methodology works in a smaller environment, whether it doesn't, whether smaller environments allow better, more efficient way of including, or more like less theoreticalized ways of including, whether these are replicable in other contexts. And this is something also in the scientific literature that I rarely found investigated. So maybe one thing that we could, like a question I can throw to all of us, is whether we could manage in the next sessions in future reflections to have also the voices of cities that are less like Torino and more like the majority, at least in Italy. Then I know that the intercultural cities network in Italy had made a tremendous effort. We wanted to say hi to Ivana, who's watching, and in general to the intercultural cities network in Italy. They made a tremendous effort, and in Italy the intercultural cities network is mainly made by smaller cities. Yeah. So we do have some networks, but other networks such as they have the presence of smaller towns is less relevant, and in international projects, European projects, less and less. So I think that's good. We could do more to know better what other dynamics are doing.
Mark, thanks a lot for that question and that comment. I mean, it's a really good issue. The question of scale is super relevant here because access to resources and connections at the international level. I'm glad that you mentioned the Italian national network. There are maybe 7 or 8 national networks across the globe, and it's true that the national networks do the same work of the international network of ICC. They do the same work at a local level, and it makes it much easier because there's geographical proximity, and they're using the same language, and they can do things because they understand the national context much better. But I think it's also interesting what you and Boshra are saying is that cities are really doing things that states aren't necessarily doing, or they're maybe not doing it in the same way. I always think that I like to work with cities because cities are not states, right? It's easier to come back to the question of belonging. I think it's easier to belong to a city than it is to belong to a state, because we know of all of the problems having to do with migration status and national identity, whereas municipal identity is something that is much easier to work on in terms of inclusion. Just a third comment is I think that the question of small or regional cities is becoming more and more important. In Quebec, we've done a lot of work on this issue because cities smaller or mid-sized cities don't have the same needs. And so they seem to talk more about what they call retention or attracting or migrant communities or welcoming, right? But I do think that I'd like to hear Irena, what you think about this. The question of scale really matters, and ICC has done a great job working with cities that are not just huge metropolises. There are huge cities in the network, but ICC does a good job with cities of different sizes, and I think size makes a difference in this field. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, we always say in ICC the size doesn't matter. In fact, the average city in ICC is maybe around 100,000. I think there are a lot more smaller cities than there are big cities. So, well, of course, we also have Mexico City. But interestingly, if you look at the Intercultural Cities Index, we have done those kind of correlations. We've seen that in terms of achievement on the index, in terms of ranking, it's not the size that determines how successful a city is at all, because it's really evenly distributed success across the scale of, by size. What really determines is the size of the migrant population. So meaning cities that have smaller migrant populations tend to be a bit behind, which is also normal because they probably haven't had the time to really address the issues and encounter the problems and build up the alliances. But as you said, scale is really important. I mean, that's why in intercultural cities we're building networks at different levels. Our national networks are important to federate cities in a certain country or region, but also to wait on the national debate, to really be actors in the national debate. It's not necessarily happening so easily, but that's the goal. So coalition building is essential. But ICC international lobbies through the Council of Europe structures, the governments at the European level. We're actually now working on a new standard setting document for intercultural integration at the national level with the 47 member states. So we have strategies at different levels, and we are now even working with regions, which would be in Canada the equivalent of Quebec or Ontario, right. In countries where in Europe there are regions, because the regions are really the middle level. They are the go-betweens, which could transfer like a transmission belt, the intercultural ideas upwards. Because it's always, and for me, it's almost always the movement is from bottom up, right? The ideas, intercultural ideas. But if you allow me, I wanted to just comment a few things on what I heard, because it's been really interesting. Mm-hmm.
And then we can open up to questions on the floor.
Yes, exactly. Just 2 minutes. I mean, anti-racism action plans, Claudio mentioned them. It's an interesting topic. It's now the season of anti-racism action plans in Europe because of the EU, of course, EU anti-racism action plans, which foresees that all countries will adopt them. The ones that I have seen, the good ones actually are very intercultural. So they're called action plans, but to really have both that prevention dimension and rapid response dimension, to have both the legal standard institutional anti-discrimination dimension as well as the dialogic interaction dimension, they have to be both anti-racist and intercultural. So I mean, I think that's the future. That's the way things will go also at the national level, but of course locally. One thing we haven't spoken much about, I think, it's about socioeconomic divides, inequality. And I think both anti-racism and interculturalism are not very strong in analyzing those or providing responses. For me, I think interculturalism, for interculturalism, the solution or the way of addressing inequality is the process. As Zara said, engaging people, leveraging local assets, it's the key. The knowledge, energy, creativity of diverse population, blending diverse perspectives to create new value. That's for interculturalism the way to deal with inequality, in a sense of lifting everybody up through creating systems, situations, institutions where everybody is recognized and enabled to participate in the productive systems of the city, and to add value. So that's I think Oslo really has been very strong on that, because Oslo for years has dealt with inclusion of migrants, minorities through the Department of Economy, if I'm not wrong. So that's always been, in a way, the aspiration to have diversity as an economic asset at the center. Now, I wanted also to say that to achieve inclusion and cohesion, we need social trust. And I want to acknowledge Rick Young from Toronto, who is with us and who is a great evangelist of social trust. And social trust is a very complex phenomena. So interculturalists are trying to leverage social trust by dialogue, interaction, etc. But by doing this in parallel, we also need to tackle specific issues like discrimination, hate speech, violence. We spoke about it, and that's where anti-racism is probably better in finding and mobilizing rapid response. And finally, I found Oslo's approach in connecting national minority agendas with the intercultural agenda really interesting. I think that's the future as well, because interculturalism has been a bit insular in dealing with migration in particular, but not, for instance, with minorities like Roma and travelers. And despite all the efforts to do that, we haven't yet found really smooth ways of doing it, where, ways that are natural and organic. And we're looking at, innovative solutions from Oslo and others as well. I'll stop here because we want to hear from our audience.
Yeah, we have maybe about 20 minutes to take questions from the floor. I see two questions already in the chat that we can take up. The first question, I think, is kind of targeted at, it's coming from Guy Drudy in Montreal, who's asking a question maybe for Zara, but also for Marco. How can we generalize these four pillars that were mentioned from Bradford? And how can they be kind of integrated into... Zara, do you have any ideas about? I imagine you've thought quite a bit about that. I think the question has to do with how to create kind of a social link in the city by using the four pillars. Any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, so I can talk about kind of our four pillars. So essentially, they are the foundation that we've created for the program itself. But actually, our strategy is much more wider than the program, because it expands across different areas and sectors. So certainly, it's not limited just to the program. I think the thing to say here is that when we developed the four pillars, we were thinking about how our interventions and the designs of our projects, how they work as a system within each of the pillars. So it's not just about what they do, it's the interaction relationship that they have with each other that's really important. So we look at each pillar almost being an ecosystem in itself, and just testing and trialing some new things. I think that's just really important. And then along with that, we've kind of coupled it with networks at different levels as well. So the three networks that I'd mentioned is at that community level, organizational level when we're talking about practice and theory, and we're talking about leadership level, which is about making sure we're involving our system leaders in looking at long-term legacy change and sustainability. And then along with all of those kind of four pillars, we kind of really cover what we call 8 domains that kind of overlap these four pillars. So it's basically what we're really trying to test and really harness, I guess, through them. So that's really around things like civic engagement, volunteering, trust and safety, neighbourhoods and community, and social networks and relationships. And we're using I guess, the interventions and the projects and the networks to really just create change, and being a catalyst for change, basically at multiple different levels. I think that in terms of creating the generalization of the 4 pillars, it's actually formulated part of our quality objectives. So in other words, they've just such a strong foundation that the local authority have used them as a way to underpin all of our qualities work as well. So I think, you know, just because of how widely encompassing they are, I think the only thing that what we allude to for the 4 pillars is actually how it connects to things like health and well-being. And ultimately, when we're thinking about people belonging in a place or how they interact in a space, we're ultimately talking about their happiness. Ultimately, people want, in terms of the goal, is to be happy. They want their families to do well. They want their children to grow up in good schools and to get good jobs, and they want a good life ultimately. Well, and I think that the 4 pillars are the strands that kind of lead to that, really.
Interesting. So the 4th pillar is about feeling safe and about feeling happy and healthy. And it sounds like the pillars are they're not just kind of principles, but you see there you see the pillars as ecosystems or as networks. It would be interesting to compare the 4 pillars in Bradford to the ICC pillars. The ICC talks a lot about this policy triangle, and I think the policy triangle from ICC is a part of the inspiration for the webinar today, focusing on these 3 ideas of diversity, equality, and interactions. Those are policy points, but they're also pillars and principles, right? And so if you think about what we're talking about today, we haven't really talked too much about diversity, right? Which I think is great. If you look at the comment that Barry gives us from Bradford also, interculturalism and anti-racism make it possible for us to focus on those other 2 pillars, right? Because it's important to talk about diversity, but sometimes talking too much about diversity can also be a problem. I was interested in what Barry said in the chat, because he said it's like important in cities to get past these kind of ethnic and kind of cultural categories and talk more about social, and civic identities. I think that's a really key. That's another point that I think interculturalists and anti-racists share, even though anti-racists think that interculturalists just want to talk about culture, right? I think they actually share the idea of wanting to go beyond culture and not seeing culture as something that's kind of an obstacle or the only thing that we talk about when we analyze these types of questions. In the chat, there was also a question from Nicolas, which is pretty interesting. He says, Bosha, maybe you want to take on that question. He asks, how do you integrate an anti-discrimination perspective on an institutional level, right? Don't we risk sacrificing the nature of anti-racism, which is about protest and about contestation and resistance?
That's a very good question, and in my perspective, anti-racism is also about reclaiming institutions.
Yeah, okay.
So how do you reclaim institutions if you do it only in the streets? And I would also plead for a lot of strategies, like a lot of different strategies. Like sometimes people don't want to make the transformation within the institutions, and it's okay. You can we can protest, and sometimes I still protest, but not in the same not with the same visibility. But we need protest and demonstrations, and we need radical discourses because and sometimes radical actions. But when we enter the institutions, that's why I always use the word metabolize. How an anti-racist like me can enter the institutions and use our vision and the objectives of anti-racism, but also how you can do it in sometimes dealing with a different like temporality, a different timeline and different rhythm. So how you deal with the urgent matters that are brought by anti-racists. So how you bring violence, how you bring symbolic violence or real violence, and how you translate it in the institution. So for me, it's really it's about how you make strategies cohabitate. And I would finish in saying that in 4 months, what I can say is that our institutions are not actualized. Is it an English word, Bob?
Maybe they're not realized.
Realized.
Yeah.
They need sometimes to be rebooted and to be like.
I see. Okay, I see what you're saying. They're not up to date. You mean they're not up to date?
We need updates, and for like on anti-discriminations and anti-racist perspective, I think that's we are doing from the streets to the institutions, and I totally believe that anti-racists should enter and transform the administrations from within, but also in creating, I would say, interactive or participatory spaces to make the institution talk to anti-racists. And that's why my job is really a crazy one, because I have a lot of a lot of people are waiting for a change on anti-racism in Montreal. And of course, they're all in the streets. So I have to talk to the institution and to translate to people outside. So it's a challenge.
It's a challenge, but wouldn't you agree? I think you said this. Wouldn't you agree that people need to stay in the streets also? Like we need people in the streets putting pressure, because that's what they do best. And that's what moves public opinion. Interculturalism isn't really good at moving public opinion. Like, because people don't really understand interculturalism. We're good with policy. We're good with kind of organizational change and kind of facilitating dialogues and stuff. But anti-racists are really good at like messaging and getting the message out about the fact that there might be a problem. Irena, I wanted to come back to that question with you and ask you what you think about those differences in styles, and also what does ICC say about, cultural identity or ethnicity, right? I mean, I know the way you talk about interculturalism, it's by no means just limited to ethnicity. What does ICC do with that?
Well, I mean, as you know, we have had this conversation before. What does culture stand for in the concept of interculturalism? And we were always saying that the goal is somehow to annihilate the anthropological understanding. I mean, it starts from the anthropological understanding of culture, as in,
we're all guilty.
Combination of
anthropologists are guilty. We're
that's
guilty.
Right.
Guilty as charged.
A combination of ethnic, linguistic, religious, worldview, practice, cultural practice elements, but to go beyond that into the deeper understanding of identity as a personally determined fact, right? So interculturalism talks about cultures and interaction between cultures and blending of cultures, etc. But what it does want to achieve is that everybody understands that culture, in the end of the day, is personal. It's a personal combination of identity elements.
Yeah.
And if we achieve this as a personal level, we should also be able to achieve it at the level of collective, of a collective culture, of a collective understanding of our local culture or a national culture even. I mean, at the moment we are having discussions in the Council of Europe as to, is it even possible in some countries to introduce much more modern understanding of a national culture, which is pluralistic, which is evolving, which is inclusive, instead of being seen as some kind of a monolithic creation. And it's not very easy in all countries, but we are going in that direction. That's our aspiration.
doing hard work. So in French, when we get to the end of a session or a conference, they have this great expression in the French language where the moderator asks people to say a few words at the end, and the expression that they use is le mot de la fin. They say like the word of the end, right? Like as if you could just choose one word, right? It's not one word, obviously, but I thought that would be a nice way to end the webinar if our four panelists would think about maybe one word that helps them keep focused on these issues and kind of move ahead in a constructive, practical way. What word would you choose to kind of describe the vision or the kind of the roadmap for what you've been doing in different cities? Anyone want to chime in?
Can I use two words?
Yeah, go ahead, Bushra. I'll give you two. Take two.
Okay. I would quote Soya, and I would say spatial justice.
Spatial justice?
Yeah, spatial justice.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's two words, but it's one idea.
Yeah.
Interesting. Anyone else?
I have to use maybe a few sentences, but when I listened to you, it's been very interesting. But we in Oslo now, we want to sanction bad behavior. We want to say that something is not okay. And that reaction, and that could be to a school or a pub or anything. When we don't use sanction in a way that caught us with, but we say that you should change. You should stop this bad behavior. And that offer implies interculturalism. That means that you have to start to be inclusive and to think about that.
Okay, that's interesting.
So that is my summary.
Okay, so can I'll give you three words. You should change. Does that work? Maybe that's not the right key choice.
I had another sentence here from Greek philosophers who said that in theory there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. So that's the city reality. We have to take all these ideas and think practical.
That's great. Okay, thanks to Ralph. Zara or Marco? Claudio?
I'm going to be cheeky and use three words as well. I'm going to say immersed, invested, and connected. And I think there are multiple different levels why I say that.
Interesting. Three words that begin with immersed. What was it? Interconnected, immersed, and
immersed, invested, and connected.
Interesting. That sounds nice. Marco, Claudio?
Well, we got 5 words, but it's the two of us, so we can make it count. The 5 words are the times they are changing. Well, we can explain why, but we can also leave it the secret.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to conclude our session today. The times are changing, and I'm really inspired to see all of these ideas and critical thoughts about what to do in response to these changes.
Can I just say too, which is a combination of what others have said, if you don't engage with people, you will have to punish their bad behavior.
Okay, that's like 10 words, Irena. That's totally not fair. Anyway, thank you very much to everyone, especially to our panelists who agreed to take the time to prepare presentations and kind of share ideas about challenges and best practices. And thanks also to Lisa from Minneapolis, who couldn't stay with us until the end, and especially the Council of Europe. Irena, do you want to sign off for us?
Yes, I want to thank Bob very much. For really nice, I admire your moderation. Although I always envy you, because when you moderate, you always have and where I do it too, mind you, I always speak after each speaker too. But it's good. It's really, really nice. So thank you so much, Bob, for helping to make this happen. Thank you to our speakers. Thanks very much to Evgeny from the ICC team, who has been dealing with all of the logistical aspects, and of course to the ICC social media manager and the ICC colleagues who are listening and also retweeting and supporting, and to all of you, all of the participants, and see you then maybe at the next edition. We don't know what it will be about, but
we don't know. Let's hope there will be
something about the revolution.
Oh, I thought you were going to choose that as your keyword.
See you soon.
Okay.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.